Welcome to the debate. So, the material we're looking at today outlines the path to miracles through acceptance. It presents a pretty stark contrast between what it calls the cycle of struggle and the power of acceptance.
Right.
And the question we're really wrestling with is this. Is relying on your own strength and judgment, what the material labels the ego, is that fundamentally flawed? Does it just lead to suffering and block solutions? Or is that framework, a bit too simplistic? I'll be arguing that acceptance and surrender are necessary precursors to accessing a greater source of strength.
And I'm going to challenge that premise. The idea that our own inherent strength and effort have to be categorized as some kind of egoic failure that only leads to suffering. I think that needs a closer look.
Well, look, the material gives us what I think is a pretty compelling diagnosis. It suggests that when we rely solely on our own finite resources, the ego, we create this vicious cycle where we feel trapped. Self-defense, in this view, isn't protection. It's a mindset that blocks what this greater source can offer. And that's why the 3 steps are so crucial. First, you have to quietly accept challenges, health, family, whatever. Second, you surrender to a greater universal power. And then finally, you practice a daily acceptance meditation. That's really the only path forward.
Okay. I appreciate you clarifying the definition of ego from the text, but I just don't buy the blanket condemnation of personal effort. This idea that our own agency is somehow fundamentally at odds with progress, it just doesn't sit right with me. While acceptance is, sure, a useful tool, framing the use of one's own intellect as inherently leading to suffering, that sidelines the need for personal agency, especially with the very serious issues mentioned in Step 1. So let's dig into that a bit. Why must all proactive attempts to solve problems be characterized as mere self-defense or some kind of blockage? Isn't it possible that sometimes your own strength and judgment is exactly what's needed to initiate change or to protect necessary boundaries? The material seems to conflate healthy, assertive action with egoic resistance.
I see where you're coming from on agency, but I think that reading contradicts the core mechanism here. The material is very clear. The cycle of struggle is the cycle of suffering. And that's precisely because it's based on this belief that we're separate and have to constantly fight. It defines using only your own strength as the blockage, because true strength, it only emerges when we cease resisting and allow that inner life force, or whatever you want to call it, to operate. The proof is that feeling of being saved that comes after the surrender.
I take your point that surrender promises this kind of transcendent experience, but let's get practical for a second. Let's look at Step 3, practicing acceptance for 15 minutes a day and stopping trying to solve everything. If someone is facing a major health crisis or a really complex family issue, is that mental shift sufficient? It seems to prescribe a passive state where, direct action and intellectual judgment are urgently needed. If I need complex surgery, does 15 minutes of meditation replace the judgment I need to choose the right doctor?
See, I'm not convinced by that line of reasoning because you're misrepresenting the function of acceptance. Acceptance it's not the solution itself, it's step 1. It's the prerequisite shift in consciousness. Without that initial quiet acknowledgement of this is what's happening, you stay locked in fear and resistance. And that resistance is what blocks you from the greater source of strength. Once you achieve acceptance, the actions you take are then guided by a power far greater than the individual ego. That's where the miracles come from. So at the end of the day, the core claim is that fighting just generates more suffering. The material suggests that the path to real strength and transformation requires this intentional move beyond the struggling ego through quiet acceptance and surrender.
And while I absolutely agree that acceptance is valuable for mental peace, defining all personal struggle and the use of one's own judgment as an ego failure is just too limiting. The need for proactive, agentic problem solving, that remains a critical alternative perspective here.
So we've clearly outlined the tension between individual effort and the power that can come from letting go.
Yeah, there's clearly much more to explore when weighing the limits of the self against the potential power of surrender.